Chapter 20. The Great Experiment. If any evidence had been wanted of how absolutely one and all of us had come to believe in the spiritual existence of the Egyptian queen, it would have been found in the change which in a few minutes had been effected in us by the statement of voluntary negation made, we all believed, through Margaret. Despite the coming of the fearful ordeal, the sense of which it was impossible to forget, we looked and acted as though a great relief had come to us. We had indeed lived in such a state of terrorism during the days when Mr. Trelawney was lying in a trance, that the feeling had bitten deeply into us. No one knows till he has experienced it, what it is to be in constant dread of some unknown danger, which may come at any time and in any form. The change was manifested in different ways according to each nature. Margaret was sad. Dr. Winchester was in high spirits and keenly observant, the process of thought, which had served as an antidote to fear, being now relieved from this duty, added to his intellectual enthusiasm. Mr. Corbeck seemed to be in a retrospective rather than a speculative mood. I myself was rather inclined to be gay. The relief from certain anxiety regarding Margaret was sufficient for me for the time. As to Mr. Trelawney, he seemed less changed than any. Perhaps this was only natural, as he had had in his mind the intention, for so many years, of doing that in which we were tonight engaged, that any event connected with it could only seem to him as an episode, a step to the end. His was that commanding nature which looks so to the end of an undertaking that all else is of secondary importance. Even now, though his terrible sternness relaxed under the relief from the strain, he never flagged nor faltered for a moment in his purpose. He asked us men to come with him, and going to the hall we presently managed to lower into the cave an oak table, fairly long and not too wide, which stood against the wall in the hall. This we placed under the strong cluster of electric lights in the middle of the cave. Margaret looked on for a while. Then all at once her face blanched, and in an agitated voice she said, "What are you going to do, father?" "To unroll the mummy of the cat. Queen Tera will not need her familiar tonight. If she should want him, it might be dangerous to us, so we shall make him safe. You are not alarmed, dear?" "Oh, no," she answered quickly, "but I was thinking of my Silvio and how I should feel if he had been the mummy that was to be unswathed." Mr. Trelawney got his knives and scissors ready and placed the cat on the table. It was a grim beginning to our work, and it made my heart sink when I thought of what might happen in that lonely house in the mid-gloom of the night. The sense of loneliness and isolation from the world was increased by the moaning of the wind, which had now risen ominously, and by the beating of waves on the rocks below. But we had too grave a task before us to be swayed by external manifestations. The unrolling of the mummy began. There was an incredible number of bandages, and the tearing sound, they being stuck fast to each other by bitumen and gums and spices, and the little cloud of red pungent dust that arose, pressed on the senses of all of us. As the last wrappings came away, we saw the animal seated before us. He was all hunkered up, his hair and teeth and claws were complete. The eyes were closed, but the eyelids had not the fierce look which I expected. The whiskers had been pressed down on the side of the face by the bandaging, but when the pressure was taken away they stood out, just as they would have done in life. He was a magnificent creature, a tiger cat of great size. But as we looked at him, our first glance of admiration changed to one of fear, and a shudder ran through each one of us, for here was a confirmation of the fears which we had endured. His mouth and his claws were smeared with the dry red stains of recent blood. Dr. Winchester was the first to recover. Blood in itself had small disturbing quality for him. He had taken out his magnifying glass and was examining the stains on the cat's mouth. Mr. Trelawney breathed loudly, as though a strain had been taken from him. "It is as I expected," he said. "This promises well for what is to follow." By this time, Dr. Winchester was looking at the red-stained paws. "As I expected," he said. "He has 7 claws, too." Opening his pocketbook, he took out the piece of blotting paper marked by Silvio's claws, on which was also marked in pencil a diagram of the cuts made on Mr. Trelawney's wrist. He placed the paper under the mummy cat's paw. The marks fitted exactly. When we had carefully examined the cat, finding, however, nothing strange about it but its wonderful preservation, Mr. Trelawney lifted it from the table. Margaret started forward, crying out, "Take care, father! Take care! He may injure you!" "Not now, my dear," he answered as he moved towards the stairway. Her face fell. "Where are you going?" she asked in a faint voice. "To the kitchen," he answered. "Fire will take away all danger for the future. Even an astral body cannot materialize from ashes." He signed to us to follow him. Margaret turned away with a sob. I went to her, but she motioned me back and whispered, No. Go with the others. Father may want you." "Oh, it seems like murder. The poor Queen's pet." The tears were dropping from under the fingers that covered her eyes. In the kitchen was a fire of wood ready laid. To this Mr. Trelawney applied a match. In a few seconds the kindling had caught and the flames leaped. When the fire was solidly ablaze, he threw the body of the cat into it. For a few seconds, it lay a dark mass amidst the flames, and the room was rank with the smell of burning hair. Then the dry body caught fire too. The inflammable substances used in embalming became new fuel, and the flames roared. A few minutes of fierce conflagration, and then we breathed freely. Queen Tara's familiar was no more. When we went back to the cave, we found Margaret sitting in the dark. She had switched off the electric light, and only a faint glow of the evening light came through the narrow openings. Her father went quickly over to her, and put his arms around her in a loving, protective way. She laid her head on his shoulder for a minute, and seemed comforted. Presently she called to me, "Malcolm, turn up the light." I carried out her orders and could see that, though she had been crying, her eyes were now dry. Her father saw it too and looked glad. He said to us in a grave tone, "Now we had better prepare for our great work. It will not do to leave anything to the last." Margaret must have had a suspicion of what was coming, for it was with a sinking voice that she asked, "What are you going to do now?" Mr. Trelawney too must have had a suspicion of her feelings, for he answered in a low tone, "To unroll the mummy of Queen Tara." She came close to him and said pleadingly in a whisper, "Father, you are not going to unswathe her, all you men, and in the glare of light." "But why not, my dear?" "Well, just think, Father, a woman, all alone in such a way, in such a place. Oh, it's cruel, cruel." She was manifestly much overcome. Her cheeks were flaming red, and her eyes were full of indignant tears. Her father saw her distress and, sympathizing with it, began to comfort her. I was moving off, but he signed to me to stay. I took it that after the usual manner of men he wanted help on such an occasion, and manlike wished to throw on someone else the task of dealing with a woman in indignant distress. However, he began to appeal first to her reason. "Not a woman, dear. A mummy. She has been dead nearly 5,000 years. "What does that matter? Sex is not a matter of years. A woman is a woman if she had been dead 5,000 centuries. And you expect her to arise out of that long sleep. It could not be real death if she is to rise out of it. You have led me to believe that she will come alive when the coffer is opened. I did, my dear, and I believe it. But if it isn't death that has been the matter with her all these years, it is something uncommonly like it. Then again, just think. It was men who embalmed her. They didn't have women's rights or lady doctors in ancient Egypt, my dear. And besides, he went on more freely, seeing that she was accepting his argument, if not yielding to it. We men are accustomed to such things. Corbeck and I have unrolled 100 mummies, and there were as many women as men amongst them. Dr. Winchester in his work has had to deal with women as well as men, till custom has made him think nothing of sex. Even Ross has in his work as a barrister. He stopped suddenly. You were going to help too? She said to me with an indignant look. I said nothing. I thought silence was best. Mr. Trelawney went on hurriedly. I could see that he was glad of interruption, for the part of his argument concerning a barrister's work was becoming decidedly weak. My child, you will be with us yourself. Would we do anything which would hurt or offend you? Come now, be reasonable. We are not at a pleasure party. We are all grave men, entering gravely on an experiment which may unfold the wisdom of all times, and enlarge human knowledge indefinitely, which may put the minds of men on new tracks of thought and research. An experiment, as he went on, his voice deepened, which may be fraught with death to any one of us, to us all. We know from what has been that there are, or may be, vast and unknown dangers ahead of us, which none in the house today may ever see the end. Take it, my child, that we are not acting lightly, but with all the gravity of deeply earnest men. Besides, my dear, whatever feelings you or any of us may have on this subject, it is necessary for the success of the experiment to unswathe her. I think that under any circumstances it would be necessary to remove the wrappings before she became, again, a live human being, instead of a spiritualized corpse with an astral body, were her original intention carried out. And did she come to new life within her mummy wrappings, it might be to exchange a coffin for a grave. She would die the death of the buried alive. But now, when she has voluntarily abandoned for the time her astral power, there can be no doubt on the subject. Margaret's face cleared. All right, father, she said as she kissed him. But, oh, it seems a horrible indignity to a queen and a woman. I was moving away to the staircase when she called me. Where are you going? I came back and took her hand and stroked it as I answered. I shall come back when the unrolling is over. She looked at me long, and a faint suggestion of a smile came over her face as she said, Perhaps you had better stay too. It may be useful to you in your work as a barrister. She smiled out as she met my eyes, but in an instant she changed. Her face grew grave and deadly white. In a faraway voice she said, Father is right. It is a terrible occasion. We need all to be serious over it. But all the same, nay, for that very reason you had better stay, Malcolm. You may be glad later on that you were present tonight. My heart sank down at her words, but I thought it better to say nothing. Fear was stalking openly enough amongst us already. By this time Mr. Trelawney, assisted by Mr. Corbeck and Dr. Winchester, had raised the lid of the ironstone sarcophagus which contained the mummy of the Queen. It was a large one, but it was none too big. The mummy was both long and broad and high, and was of such weight that it was no easy task even for the four of us to lift it out. Under Mr. Trelawney's direction, we laid it out on the table prepared for it. Then, and then only, did the full horror of the whole thing burst upon me. There, in the full glare of the light, the whole material and sordid side of death seemed startlingly real. The outer wrappings, torn and loosened by rude touch, and with the colour either darkened by dust or worn light by friction, seemed creased as by rough treatment. The jagged edges of the wrapping cloths looked fringed. The painting was patchy and the varnish chipped. The coverings were evidently many, for the bulk was great, but through all showed that unhideable human figure, which seems to look more horrible when partially concealed than at any other time. What was before us was death, and nothing else. All the romance and sentiment of fancy had disappeared. The two elder men, enthusiasts who had often done such work, were not disconcerted, and Dr. Winchester seemed to hold himself in a business-like attitude, as if before the operating table. But I felt low-spirited, and miserable, and ashamed. And besides, I was pained and alarmed by Margaret's ghastly pallor. Then the work began. The unrolling of the mummy cat had prepared me somewhat for it, but this was so much larger, and so infinitely more elaborate that it seemed a different thing. Moreover, in addition to the ever-present sense of death and humanity, there was a feeling of something finer in all this. The cat had been embalmed with coarser materials. Here, all, when once the outer coverings were removed, was more delicately done. It seemed as if only the finest gums and spices had been used in this embalming. But there were the same surroundings, the same attendant red dust and pungent presence of bitumen. There was the same sound of rending which marked the tearing away of the bandages. There were an enormous number of these, and their bulk when opened was great. As the men unrolled them, I grew more and more excited. I did not take a part in it myself. Margaret had looked at me gratefully as I drew back. We clasped hands and held each other hard. As the unrolling went on, the wrappings became finer, and the smell less laden with bitumen but more pungent. We all, I think, began to feel it as though it caught or touched us in some special way. This, however, did not interfere with the work. It went on uninterruptedly. Some of the inner wrappings bore symbols or pictures. These were done sometimes wholly in pale green colour, sometimes in many colours, but always with a prevalence of green. Now and again Mr. Trelawney or Mr. Corbeck would point out some special drawing before laying the bandage on the pile behind them, which kept growing to a monstrous height. At last we knew that the wrappings were coming to an end. Already the proportions were reduced to those of a normal figure of the manifest height of the Queen, who was more than average tall, and as the end drew nearer, so Margaret's pallor grew, and her heart beat more and more wildly, till her breast heaved in a way that frightened me. Just as her father was taking away the last of the bandages, he happened to look up and caught the pained and anxious look of her pale face. He paused, and taking her concern to be as to the outrage on modesty, said in a comforting way, "Do not be uneasy, dear. See, there is nothing to harm you. The Queen has on a robe. Aye, and a royal robe, too." The wrapping was a wide piece the whole length of the body. It being removed, a profusely full robe of white linen had appeared, covering the body from the throat to the feet. And such linen! We all bent over to look at it. Margaret lost her concern in her woman's interest in fine stuff. Then the rest of us looked with admiration, for surely such linen was never seen by the eyes of our age. It was as fine as the finest silk, but never was spun or woven silk which lay in such gracious folds, constrict though they were by the close wrappings of the mummy cloth, and fixed into hardness by the passing of thousands of years. Round the neck it was delicately embroidered in pure gold, with tiny sprays of sycamore, and round the feet, similarly worked, was an endless line of lotus plants of unequal height, and with all the graceful abandon of natural growth. Across the body, but manifestly not surrounding it, was a girdle of jewels, a wondrous girdle which shone and glowed with all the forms and phases and colours of the sky. The buckle was a great yellow stone, round of outline, deep and curved, as if a yielding globe had been pressed down. It shone and glowed, as though a veritable sun lay within. The rays of its light seemed to strike out and illumine all around. Flanking it were two great moonstones of lesser size, whose glowing beside the glory of the sunstone was like the silvery sheen of moonlight. And then on either side, linked by golden clasps of exquisite shape, was a line of flaming jewels of which the colours seemed to glow. Each one of these stones seemed to hold a living star, which twinkled in every phase of changing light. Margaret raised her hands in ecstasy. She bent over to examine more closely, but suddenly drew back and stood fully erect at her grand height. She seemed to speak with the conviction of absolute knowledge as she said, "That is no cerement, was not meant for the clothing of death. It is a marriage robe." Mr. Trelawney leaned over and touched the linen robe. He lifted a fold at the neck, and I knew from the quick intake of his breath that something had surprised him. He lifted yet a little more, and then he, too, stood back and pointed, saying, "Margaret is right. That dress is not intended to be worn by the dead. See, her figure is not robed in it. It is but laid upon her." He lifted the zone of jewels and handed it to Margaret. Then, with both hands he raised the ample robe and laid it across the arms which she extended in natural impulse. Things of such beauty were too precious to be handled with any but the greatest care. We all stood awed at the beauty of the figure which, save for the face-cloth, now lay completely nude before us. Mr. Trelawney bent over and with hands that trembled slightly, raised this linen cloth, which was of the same fineness of the robe. As he stood back and the whole glorious beauty of the Queen was revealed, I felt a rush of shame sweep over me. It was not right that we should be there gazing with irreverent eyes on such unclad beauty. It was indecent. It was almost sacrilegious. And yet the white wonder of that beautiful form was something to dream of. It was not like death at all. It was like a statue carven in ivory by the hand of a Praxiteles. There was nothing of that horrible shrinkage which death seems to effect in a moment. There was none of the wrinkled roughness which seems to be a leading characteristic of most mummies. There was not the shrunken attenuation of a body tried in the sand, as I had seen before in museums. All the pores of the body seemed to have been preserved in some wondrous way. The flesh was full and round, as in a living person, and the skin was smooth as satin. The colour seemed extraordinary. It was like ivory, new ivory, except where the right arm with shattered, blood-stained wrist and missing hand had lain bare to exposure in the sarcophagus for so many tens of centuries. With a womanly impulse, with a mouth that drooped with pity, with eyes that flashed with anger, and cheeks that flamed, Margaret threw over the body the beautiful robe which lay across her arm. Only the face was then to be seen. This was more startling even than the body, for it seemed not dead, but alive. The eyelids were closed, but the long, black, curling lashes lay over on the cheeks. The nostrils, set in grave pride, seemed to have repose which, when it is seen in life, is greater than the repose of death. The full red lips, though the mouth was not open, showed the tiniest white line of pearly teeth within. Her hair, glorious in quantity and glossy black as the raven's wing, was piled in great masses over the white forehead, on which a few curling tresses strayed like tendrils. I was amazed at the likeness to Margaret, though I had had my mind prepared for this by Mr. Corbeck's quotation of her father's statement. This woman, I could not think of her as a mummy or a corpse, was the image of Margaret as my eyes had first lit on her. The likeness was increased by the jewelled ornament which she wore in her hair, the disc and plume such as Margaret too had worn. It too was a glorious jewel, one noble pearl of moonlight lustre, flanked by carven pieces of moonstone. Mr. Trelawney was overcome as he looked. He quite broke down, and when Margaret flew to him and held him close in her arms and comforted him, I heard him murmur brokenly, "It looks as if you were dead, my child." There was a long silence. I could hear without the roar of the wind, which was now risen to a tempest, and the furious dashing of the waves far below. Mr. Trelawney's voice broke the spell. "Later on, must you try and find out the process of embalming. It is not like any that I know. There does not seem to have been any opening cut for the withdrawing of the visceral organs, which apparently remain intact within the body. Then again, there is no moisture on the flesh, but its place is supplied with something else, as though wax or stearine had been conveyed into the veins by some subtle process. I wonder, could it be possible that at the time they could have used paraffin? It might have been by some process that we know not, pumped into the veins where it hardened." Margaret, having thrown a white sheet over the Queen's body, asked us to bring it to her own room where we laid it on her bed. Then she sent us away, saying, "Leave her alone with me. There are still many hours to pass, and I do not like to leave her lying there all stark in the glare of light. This may be the bridal she prepared for, the bridal of death, and at least she shall wear her pretty robes." When presently she brought me back to her room, the dead queen was dressed in the robes of fine linen with the embroidery of gold, and all her beautiful jewels were in place. Candles were lit around her, and white flowers lay upon her breast. Hand in hand, we stood looking at her for a while. Then, with a sigh, Margaret covered her with one of her own snowy sheets. She turned away, and after softly closing the door of the room, went back with me to the others, who had now come into the dining room. Here, we all began to talk over the things that had been and that were to be. Now and again, I could feel that one or other of us was forcing conversation, as if we were not sure of ourselves. The long wait was beginning to tell on our nerves. It was apparent to me that Mr. Trelawney had suffered in that strange trance more than we had suspected, or that he cared to show. True, his will and determination were as strong as ever, but the purely physical side of him had been weakened somewhat. It was indeed only natural that it should be. No man can go through a period of 4 days of absolute negation of life without being weakened by it somehow. As the hours crept by, the time passed more and more slowly. The other men seemed to get unconsciously a little drowsy. I wondered if, in the case of Mr. Trelawney and Mr. Corbeck, who had already been under the hypnotic influence of the Queen, the same dormance was manifesting itself. Dr. Winchester had periods of distraction which grew longer and more frequent as time wore on. As to Margaret, the suspense told on her exceedingly, as might have been expected in the case of a woman. She grew paler and paler still, till at last about midnight I began to be seriously alarmed about her. I got her to come into the library with me, and tried to make her lie down on a sofa for a little while. As Mr. Trelawney had decided that the experiment was to be made exactly at the 7th hour after sunset, it would be as nearly as possible 3 o'clock in the morning when the great trial should be made, even allowing a whole hour for the final preparations. We had still 2 hours of waiting to go through. I promised faithfully to watch her, and to awake her at any time she might name, but she would not hear of resting. She thanked me sweetly and smiled as she did so, but she assured me that she was not sleepy, and that she was quite able to bear up, that it was only the suspense and excitement of waiting that made her pale. I agreed perforce, but I kept her talking of many things in the library for more than an hour. So that at last, when she insisted on going back to her father, I felt that I had at least done something to help her pass the time. We found the three men sitting patiently in the dining room in silence. With man's fortitude, they were content to be still when they felt they had done all in their power. And so we waited. The striking of 2 o'clock seemed to freshen us all up. Whatever shadows had been settling over us during the long hours preceding seemed to lift at once, and we all went about our separate duties alert and with alacrity. We looked first to the windows to see that they were closed. For now the storm raged so fiercely that we feared it might upset our plans, which, after all, were based on perfect stillness. Then we got ready our respirators to put them on when the time should be close at hand. We had from the first arranged to use them, for we did not know whether some noxious fume might not come from the magic coffer when it should be opened. Somehow it never seemed to occur to any of us that there was any doubt as to its opening. Then, under Margaret's guidance, we carried the body of Queen Terra, still clad in her bridal robes, from her room into the cavern. It was a strange sight and a strange experience. The group of grave, silent men carrying away from the lighted candles and the white flowers the white, still figure, which looked like an ivory statue when through our moving the robe fell back. We laid her in the sarcophagus and placed the severed hand in its true position on her breast. Under it was laid the jewel of 7 stars, which Mr. Trelawney had taken from the safe. It seemed to flash and blaze as he put it in its place. The glare of the electric light shone cold on the great sarcophagus fixed ready for the final experiment. The great experiment consequent on the researches during a lifetime of these 2 travelled scholars. Again, the startling likeness between Margaret and the mummy, intensified by her own extraordinary pallor, heightened the strangeness of it all. When all was finally fixed, 3/4 of an hour had gone, for we were deliberate in all our doings. Margaret beckoned me, and I went with her to her room. There she did a thing which moved me strangely, and brought home to me keenly the desperate nature of the enterprise on which we were embarked. One by one, she blew out the candles carefully, and placed them back in their usual places. When she had finished, she said to me, "They are done with. Whatever comes, life or death, there will be no purpose in their using now." We returned to the cavern with a strange thrill as of finality. There was to be no going back now. We put on our respirators and took our places as had been arranged. I was to stand by the taps of the electric lights, ready to turn them off or on as Mr. Trelawney should direct. His last caution to me to carry out his instructions exactly was almost like a menace, for he warned me that death to any or all of us might come from any error or neglect on my part. Margaret and Dr. Winchester were to stand between the sarcophagus and the wall so that they would not be between the mummy and the magic coffer. They were to note accurately all that should happen with regard to the Queen. Mr. Trelawney and Mr. Corbeck were to see the lamps lighted, and then to take their places, the former at the foot, the latter at the head of the sarcophagus. When the hands of the clock were close to the hour, they stood ready with their lit tapers like gunners in old days with their linstocks. For the few minutes that followed, the passing of time was a slow horror. Mr. Trelawney stood with his watch in his hand, ready to give the signal. The time approached with inconceivable slowness, but at last came the whirring of wheels which warns that the hour is at hand. The striking of the silver bell of the clock seemed to smite on our hearts like the knell of doom. 1, 2, 3. The wicks of the lamp caught, and I turned out the electric light. In the dimness of the struggling lamps, and after the bright glow of the electric light, the room and all within it took weird shape, and everything seemed in an instant to change. We waited with our hearts beating. I know mine did, and I fancied I could hear the pulsation of the others. Without, the storm raged. The shutters of the narrow window shook and strained and grated, as though something was striving for entrance. The seconds seemed to pass with leaden wings. It was as though all the world were standing still. The figures of the others stood out dimly, Margaret's white dress alone showing clearly in the gloom. The thick respirators which we all wore added to the strange appearance. The thin light of the lamps, as the two men bent over the coffer, showed Mr. Trelawney's squared jaw and strong mouth, and the brown, wrinkled face of Mr. Corbeck. Their eyes seemed to glare in the light. Across the room, Dr. Winchester's eyes twinkled like stars, and Margaret's blazed like black suns. Would the lamps never burn up? It was only a few seconds in all till they did blaze up. A slow, steady light, growing more and more bright, and changing in colour from blue to crystal white. So they stayed for a couple of minutes, without any change in the coffer being noticeable. At last, there began to appear all over it a delicate glow. This grew and grew till it became like a blazing jewel, and then like a living thing whose essence was light. Mr. Trelawney and Mr. Corbeck moved silently to their places beside the sarcophagus. We waited and waited, our hearts seeming to stand still. All at once there was a sound like a tiny muffled explosion, and the cover of the coffer lifted right up, on a level plane a few inches. There was no mistaking anything now, for the whole cavern was full of light. Then, the cover, staying fast at one side, rose slowly up on the other, as though yielding to some pressure of balance. I could not see what was within, for the risen cover stood between. The coffer still continued to glow. From it began to steal a faint, greenish vapour, which floated in the direction of the sarcophagus, as though impelled or drawn towards it. I could not smell it fully on account of the respirator, but even through that I was conscious of a strange, pungent odour. The vapour got somewhat denser after a few seconds, and began to pass directly into the open sarcophagus. It was evident now that the mummied body had some attraction for it, and also that it had some effect on the body, for the sarcophagus slowly became illumined as though the body had begun to glow. I could not see within from where I stood, but I garnered from the faces of all the 4 watchers that something strange was happening. I longed to run over and take a look for myself, but I remembered Mr. Trelawney's solemn warning, and remained at my post. The storm still thundered round the house, and I could feel the rock on which it was built tremble under the furious onslaught of the waves. The shutters strained as though the screaming wind without would in very anger have forced an entrance. In that dread hour of expectancy, when the forces of life and death were struggling for the mastery, imagination was awake. I almost fancied that the storm was a living thing, and animated with the wrath of the quick. All at once, the eager faces round the sarcophagus were bent forward, the look of speechless wonder in the eyes, lit by that supernatural glow from within the sarcophagus, had a more than mortal brilliance. My own eyes were nearly blinded by the awful, paralyzing light. so that I could hardly trust them. I saw something white rising up from the open sarcophagus. Something which appeared to my tortured eyes to be filmy, like a white mist. In the heart of this mist, which was cloudy and opaque like an opal, was something like a hand, holding a fiery jewel flaming with many lights. As the fierce glow of the coffer met this new living light, the green vapour floating between them seemed like a cascade of brilliant points, a miracle of light. But at that very moment there came a change. The fierce storm, battling with the shutters of the narrow openings, won victory. With the sound of a pistol shot, one of the heavy shutters broke its fastening and was hurled on its hinges back against the wall. In rushed a fierce blast which blew the flames of the lamps to and fro, and drifted the green vapour from its course. On the very instant came a change in the outcome from the coffer. There was a moment's quick flame and a muffled explosion, and black smoke began to pour out. This got thicker and thicker with frightful rapidity, in volumes of ever-increasing density, till the whole cavern began to get obscure and its outlines were lost. The screaming wind tore in and whirled it about. At a sign from Mr. Trelawney, Mr. Corbeck went and closed the shutter and jammed it fast with a wedge. I should have liked to help, but I had to wait directions from Mr. Trelawney, who inflexibly held his post at the head of the sarcophagus. I signed to him with my hand, but he motioned me back. Gradually, the figures of all close to the sarcophagus became indistinct in the smoke, which rolled round them in thick, billowy clouds. Finally, I lost sight of them altogether. I had a terrible desire to rush over so as to be near Margaret, but again I restrained myself. If the Stygian gloom continued, light would be a necessity of safety, and I was the guardian of the light. My anguish of anxiety as I stood to my post was almost unendurable. The coffer was now but a dull colour, and the lamps were growing dim as though they were being overpowered by the thick smoke. Absolute darkness would soon be upon us. I waited and waited, expecting every instant to hear the command to turn up the light. But none came. I waited still and looked with harrowing intensity at the rolling billows of smoke still pouring out of the casket whose glow was fading. The lamps sank down and went out, one by one. Finally, there was but one lamp alight, and that was dimly blue and flickering. I kept my eyes fixed towards Margaret, in the hope that I might see her in some lifting of the gloom. It was for her now that all my anxiety was claimed. I could just see her white frock beyond the dim outline of the sarcophagus. Deeper and deeper grew the black mist, and its pungency began to assail my nostrils as well as my eyes. Now the volume of smoke coming from the coffer seemed to lessen, and the smoke itself to be less dense. Across the room I saw a movement of something white where the sarcophagus was. There were several such movements. I could just catch a quick glint of white through the dense smoke in the fading light. For now even the last lamp began to flicker with the quick leaps before extinction. Then the last glow disappeared. I felt that the time had come to speak, so I pulled off my respirator and called out, "Shall I turn on the light?" There was no answer. Before the thick smoke choked me, I called again, but more loudly. "Mr. Trelawney, shall I turn on the light? Answer me. If you do not forbid me, I shall turn it on." As there was no reply, I turned the tap. To my horror, there was no response. Something had gone wrong with the electric light. I moved, intending to run up the staircase to seek the cause, but I could now see nothing. All was pitch dark. I groped my way across the room to where I thought Margaret was. As I went, I stumbled across a body. I could feel by her dress that it was a woman. My heart sank. Margaret was unconscious, or perhaps dead. I lifted the body in my arms and went straight forward till I touched a wall. Following it round, I came to the stairway and hurried up the steps with what haste I could make, hampered as I was with my dear burden. It may have been that hope lighted my task, but as I went, the weight that I bore seemed to grow less as I ascended from the cavern. I laid the body in the hall and groped my way to Margaret's room, where I knew there were matches and the candles which she had placed beside the Queen. I struck a match, and oh, it was good to see the light. I lit 2 candles, and taking one in each hand, hurried back to the hall where I had left, as I had supposed, Margaret. Her body was not there, but on the spot where I had laid her was Queen Tara's bridal robe, and surrounding it the girdle of wondrous gems. Where the heart had been, lay the jewel of 7 stars. Sick at heart, and with a terror which has no name, I went down into the cavern. My 2 candles were like mere points of light in the black, impenetrable smoke. I put up again to my mouth the respirator which hung round my neck, and went to look for my companions. I found them all where they had stood. They had sunk down on the floor, and were gazing upwards with fixed eyes of unspeakable terror. Margaret had put her hands before her face, but the glassy stare of her eyes through her fingers was more terrible than an open glare. I pulled back the shutters of all the windows to let in what air I could. The storm was dying away as quickly as it had risen, and now it only came in desultory puffs. It might well be quiescent, its work was done. I did what I could for my companions, but there was nothing that could avail. There, in that lonely house, far away from aid of man, naught could avail. It was merciful that I was spared the pain of hoping.